There was a time when the gods walked among men and taught them the arts of civilization. These legends are not dreams, but dim memories of a forgotten past. In every myth, there is a memory, and some memories refuse to die. In part 1, we follow the survivors through tools, genes, and bloodlines. But blood is not the only thing that survives a catastrophe. Stories survive, names survive, sacred places survive. And across the Americas, one story keeps reappearing again and again. A story of strangers who came from afar. They arrived with knowledge. They taught architecture, astronomy, agriculture, law, morality, and healing. They were remembered as teachers, civilizers, sometimes even gods. Then, as suddenly as they came, they vanished. Who were these people? And why do so many cultures remember them? In this episode, we follow the living memory of the New World. From the Yurok of California to the Toltecs, the Aztecs, the Maya, the Inca, and the forgotten cities of the Andes. We will also step into one of the strangest chapters in American history, the reports of giant skeletons, the newspaper accounts, the missing bones, and the institutions that decided what history the public was allowed to see. This is not just about lost history. It's about the war for the past, and the question they never wanted you to ask. What if the myths were true? Welcome back to the third narrative. The Yurok tribe of Northern California has lived along the Klamath River for 10,000 years. In 1916, a Yurok woman named Lucy Thompson wrote To the American Indian, a book that preserves her people's oral history. What she described is astonishing.
When the Indians first made their appearance on the Klamath River, it was already inhabited by a white race of people, known among us as the Wagas. These white people were found to inhabit the whole continent and were a highly moral and civilized race. They heartily welcomed the Indians to their country and taught us all their arts and sciences. After a time, there were intermarriages between the two races, but these were never promiscuous. Wars and quarrels were unknown in this golden age of happiness. No depredations were ever committed upon the property of their people, as the white people ruled with beacon light of kindness. And our people still worship the hallowed places where once they trod. Their morals were far superior to the white people of today. Their ideals were high and inspired our people with greatness. After we had lived with these ancient people so long, they suddenly called their host together and mysteriously disappeared for a distant land, we know not where.
I want to start by saying this is not an archaeological report, so it's not official, but that does not make it meaningless. The second narrative often treats oral traditions as primitive storytelling, but the third narrative asks a different question. What if some myths were memory? What if Lucy Thompson's account preserved a fragment of something older? A memory of earlier people, earlier teachers, earlier contact. Because in part 1, we already saw that the story of the Americas may not be as simple as the classroom version suggests. Clovis tools raise questions. Solutrean comparisons raise questions. Haplogroup X raises questions. Bloodline geography raises questions. And now, indigenous memory adds another layer. The Wagas are described as people who were already there, people who taught, people who intermarried, people who vanished. That does not prove Atlantis, but it fits the pattern we are following. Not a complete record, not a clean map, but fragments, tools, genes, blood, and now memory. This is not an isolated story, because thousands of miles away, in the heart of Mesoamerica, the same pattern appears again. Enter the Toltecs, the civilization that came before the Aztecs. And at the center of their memory stands one of the most mysterious figures in the ancient Americas, Quetzalcoatl, the Feathered Serpent. To most people, that name sounds purely mythological, a serpent god, a symbol of wisdom and divine power. But in the traditions collected by early biographers, Quetzalcoatl is described as something more human. A teacher, a priest, a civilizer, a mysterious figure from the East.
From the distant East, this mysterious person came to Tula and became the high priest and patron god of the ancestors of the Toltecs. He is described as having been a white man with strong formation of body, broad forehead, large eyes, and flowing beard. He wore a mitre on his head and was dressed in a long white robe reaching to his feet and covered with red crosses. He never married, was most chaste and pure in life, and condemned sacrifices except of fruits and flowers.
That is not how most people imagine a serpent god. That sounds like a memory of a person, or at least a memory wrapped in myth. Quetzalcoatl is said to have brought knowledge, metallurgy, calendar systems, ethics, spiritual instruction, and sacred order. And when his mission was complete, he did not simply die, he departed. Some versions say he sailed away to the east, promising one day to return. A story we have heard before, and one we will hear again. But here is where the pattern deepens. Just like the Yurok remembered the Wagas leaving for a mysterious land, the Aztecs traced their origins to a lost homeland, Aztlan. Aztlan was remembered as a place of origin, a sacred homeland. In some traditions, an island, a place from which the people eventually departed. Now listen to the sound of the word, Aztlan, Atlantis. Maybe that is a coincidence. Maybe it is not. But the name is not the only echo. A lost homeland associated with water. A mysterious teacher arriving from afar. Knowledge carried forward into a later civilization. None of this proves a direct connection, but it gives us another reason to ask whether the peoples of the Americas remembered contact with an older world. And then, just like in Egypt, the civilizations of Mesoamerica built pyramids, massive sacred mountains of stone, built as bridges between earth and sky. Why is it that whenever we find these stories of gods descending from the sky or crossing the sea, we so often find pyramids? Why do these monuments rise in the places touched by these godlike teachers? Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, Osiris in Egypt, Viracocha in the Andes. Different names, different lands, but same pattern. Donnelly argues that
the pyramid is a natural and logical outgrowth of the idea of a holy mountain, the high place where the gods dwell. And we find pyramidal structures in Atlantis, according to the traditions preserved by the Egyptians and Mayas.
And that is the key. The pyramid is not just architecture. It is memory in stone, a sacred mountain rebuilt by human hands, a monument to a time when heaven and earth were thought to be connected. Could the pyramids of the Americas be echoes of an older sacred system? Could they be markers left behind by survivors, teachers, or inheritors of a lost world? We cannot prove that from one monument. But when pyramids, flood myths, visitor traditions, and lost homeland stories keep reappearing together, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. And then there's another detail worth mentioning. The Aztecs did not claim to have built every sacred structure they inherited. Many temples and pyramids were already old when later civilizations found them. They were adopted, revered, reused. Just like the Uruk, who remembered the sacred places where the Wagas once walked. The builders vanished, but the holy places remained. In 1519, a pale-skinned, bearded man arrived from the east by ship. His name was Hernán Cortés, and when he came into the world of the Aztecs, the memory of Quetzalcoatl was still alive. The resemblance was dangerous. A man from the east, bearded, foreign, arriving by sea, connected in the minds of some to an old prophecy of return. But Cortés was not Quetzalcoatl. He was the inversion of the memory. Where the original teacher brought knowledge, Cortés brought conquest. Where the remembered civilizer brought law and balance, Cortés brought disease, destruction, and empire. And this distinction matters, because Lucy Thompson makes a similar point in her own way. The Wagas, in her account, were nothing like the white people who later arrived in California. The ancient ones were remembered as teachers. The modern colonizers were not. That contrast is important. The memory was not simply of white people. It was of a different kind of visitor. Someone noble, someone earlier, someone whose arrival belonged to another age. And that is the tragedy. The Aztecs may have mistaken Cortés for the return of a sacred figure. But the deeper truth is that they were remembering someone else, someone whose memory still burned like a fading star in the collective soul. And the pattern does not end with Quetzalcoatl. It echoes across jungles and deserts, across highlands and coasts, across civilization separated by distance, language, and time. The Maya remembered Kukulkan, the Feathered Serpent. And high in the Andes, the Inca told of Viracocha. Like Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha was remembered by some chroniclers as a bearded figure in long robes. He appeared after a cataclysm, restored order, taught the people, gave rules how they should live. Then, when his work was done, he vanished across the sea. Different names, different regions, but same structure. A teacher arrives after destruction. He brings law, compassion, healing, agriculture, astronomy, or sacred knowledge. He helps rebuild the world. Then he disappears. So what are we looking at? The second narrative says these are myths, symbols, psychological archetypes. And maybe they are. But the third narrative asks whether these are also memories, encoded in stories, preserved in ritual, passed down by people who remembered that civilization had been taught, not invented from nothing. And wherever these figures appeared, the same architectural language often follows. Sacred mountains, pyramids, temples, stones aligned to heaven. The people may change, the language may change, but the pattern remains. And that brings us to Tiwanaku. At nearly 12,000 feet above sea level, near Lake Titicaca, the ruins of Tiwanaku rise from the earth like a dream. Massive stones, precise cuts, monumental platforms. A city built at an altitude where even survival requires adaptation. And when the Spanish asked the Inca who built it, the answer was not simple. Not us, they said. The Inca remembered Tiwanaku as a place older than themselves. A place associated with beings who came before. Giants, gods, people from another age. And once again, the name that surfaces is Viracocha, the civilizer, the teacher. So now step back. What we are seeing is not one isolated legend. It is a reoccurring memory. white-skinned or light-skinned strangers, bearded teachers, sacred lawgivers, figures who arrived from the sea or vanished into it. The question is not whether every description is literal. The question is why the structure keeps repeating. Were these Atlantean survivors, descendants of Cro-Magnon navigators, remnants of an older priesthood, or post-cataclysmic memories preserved under different names? Those questions remain open, but they were not the only memories buried beneath the surface of the Americas. Because alongside the stories of teachers, there are also stories of giants, and those stories lead us into a much darker chapter. For centuries, stories of giants have appeared across the Americas. Some are preserved in indigenous traditions. Others appeared in the pages of old newspapers. Reports of enormous skeletons, ancient burial mounds, oversized skulls, bones said to belong to people far taller than ordinary humans. During the 19th and early 20th century, newspapers across the United States repeatedly published accounts of giant skeletons discovered in mounds, caves, and burial sites. On December 25, 1868, in Minnesota, a 7-foot skeleton with bones weighing up to 300 pounds was discovered. On December 20th, 1879, a 9-foot skeleton with an enormous skull was found in one of Wisconsin's mysterious mounds. On May 24th, 1882, St. Paul, Minnesota reported that teenage boys had stumbled upon giant skeletons buried in a 60-foot mound in the Red River Valley. On November 20th, 1883, in West Virginia, excavations of a 50-foot mound revealed multiple 7-foot skeletons. On May 5th, 1885, 3 7-foot skeletons and 1 8-foot skeleton were uncovered in Ohio. On February 11th, 1902, 12-foot skeletons were uncovered in New Mexico, with one forearm alone measuring 4 feet in length. On September 7th, 1904, in New York, yet another set of giant remains was found, this time buried near Harlem. On May 3rd, 1912, at Lake Lawn Farm, brothers opened a large burial mound and discovered 18 massive skeletons. Their skulls were described as much larger than modern humans, with sloping foreheads and protruding nasal bones, features eerily similar to Cro-Magnon skulls. These stories follow the same pattern. A mound is opened, bones are found. The skeleton is described as unusually large. The remains are sent away for study. Then, the trail goes cold. Why were these stories so common? Why were they taken seriously enough to be printed again and again? Why did so many accounts place these discoveries inside ancient mounds or sacred burial sites? And why do so many of the remains disappear from the public record? The official explanation we are given is simple. It was bad reporting, nothing but hoaxes, a misidentification, 19th century sensationalism. And maybe that explains some of it. But does it explain all of it? That is the question. Because the giant tradition is not just a newspaper phenomenon. It appears in myth.
And earth received them all, and in the course of time bore the strong Erinyes and the great giants with gleaming armor.
It appears in the Bible.
There were giants in the earth in those days.
It appears in the Book of Enoch.
And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants.
It appears in native traditions as the Siteka. Different cultures, different languages, different continents, but the same recurring memory. So when American newspapers repeatedly report giant bones, and those reports echo older traditions about a previous race of beings, the third narrative does not simply laugh and move on. It asks, what if the myth and the mound stories were both pointing towards something older? What if at least some of these accounts preserved a real anomaly that later institutions had no interest in explaining? And that brings us to the institution at the center of the controversy, the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian Institution was created for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. That was the promise. A national institution dedicated to preserving, studying, and sharing the past. But every institution that controls knowledge faces the same temptation: to become the gate, to decide what counts as history, what counts as myth, what counts as evidence, what counts as nonsense. And when it comes to the ancient Americas, that gatekeeping matters. Because the Smithsonian did not merely study artifacts, it collected remains, it excavated mounds, it received bones, it organized the official interpretation of America's ancient past. And over time, the accepted story hardened. The mounds were not built by a lost race, not by giants, not by Atlanteans, not by an ancient white civilization. They were built by native peoples. Now, part of that correction matters. The old lost white race of mound builders theory was often used to erase native achievement. This is not what the third narrative is doing. We are not here to steal the accomplishments of indigenous civilizations and hand them to Europeans. We are asking a different question. Was the official correction also used to shut down every anomaly that did not fit the new model? Because history is rarely controlled by one lie. More often, it is controlled by a boundary. You are allowed to believe this, but you are not allowed to ask that. You may discuss mounds as native achievements, but you may not ask whether older contact, earlier teachers, lost lineages, or unusual remains complicate the story. That is how the second narrative protects itself, not always by destroying evidence, but by deciding which questions are allowed. The Smithsonian and other institutions say the claims about giant skeletons are hoaxes, exaggerations, or myths. But here's the real question. If a discovery destroys everything you have taught about human origins, do you present it to the public and allow them to decide? Or do you dismiss it and make sure no one sees the evidence? Because here is the problem. While the reports have been dismissed by the Smithsonian, the remains are gone, which means the question is closed. The public will never get the chance to see the evidence and decide for themselves. Once the gatekeepers decide the answer, the past is no longer a search. It becomes a script. So why does this matter? Why spend time on old myths, vanished teachers, pyramids, giant skeleton reports, and institutional gatekeepers? Because this series is not just about Atlantis. It is about memory. Who gets to keep it? Who gets to interpret it? And who gets to erase it? Why is an institution that is paid for by your tax dollars deciding what history you are allowed to know? Why are they dictating what is real and what is not? Why is the second narrative the preferred history? This is not just about ancient skeletons or lost civilizations. This is about control. If you control the past, you control the present. If you control the present, you control the future. They do not want you to question the history we've been taught, which is exactly why we are. In part 1, we saw clues in tools, genes, and bloodlines. In part 2, we followed the memory itself, the Wagos of Uric tradition, Quetzalcoatl and the lost homeland of Aztlan, Viracocha, Tiwanaku, the pyramids, the giants, the missing bones, and the institutions that told you not to look too closely. None of these prove Atlantis alone, but together they form a pattern. Teachers from across the sea, civilizers after catastrophe, lost homelands, sacred mountains, ancient giants, buried bones. That is not random. That is a map. A map the second narrative does not want to read. Because if Atlantis were real, then history is not what we were taught. Civilization did not simply begin in Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago. The Americas were not isolated until Christopher Columbus. The myths were not just myths. And the past was not a straight line from primitive survival to modern progress. It was older, stranger, broken, and buried. I do not claim to have all the answers, but I do know this. We have been lied to, plain and simple. The version of history we were handed is too small, too clean, too controlled. For generations, we have been spoon-fed the most boring, uninspiring, sanitized version of history possible, while the real story, the extraordinary story, the dangerous story, remained locked away in symbols, ruins, myths, and forbidden questions. And the key to unlocking it may be Atlantis, not as a fantasy, not as a fairy tale, but as the missing link between the first narrative and the second, between myth and memory, between the world before the flood and the civilizations that rose from its ruins. We have followed the survivors into the Americas, but now the question changes. If Atlantis left fragments behind, then those fragments did not remain only in the New World. They moved through every ancient civilization that rose after the collapse. So next, we follow the trail into the Old World, into Egypt, into the symbols, priesthoods, gods, and empires that inherited the memory of a world that came before. I'll see you in the next episode.